I want to talk about issues within the metal community. Specifically, I want to talk about the issues that metal as a community and as a genre have with gender. You could call this a feminist critique of metal culture, but regardless, it's an insider's critique. I've been listening to metal my whole life. I've been involved with the community for half of my life. I've been in bands, released albums, I've written plenty of music, I've played plenty of shows, I've met bands, met fans, and I've talked with people in the community in person and online, and I've lived and breathed metal for as long as I can remember. I listen to metal every day, and I listen to mostly metal. So this video isn't about hating metal. It's actually about how much I love metal. But I've realized over time that I love metal's potential more often than I love its practice. In theory, metal has the potential to be one of the most ambitious and most powerful genres ever, and this is best exemplified by bands who utilize the sound together with a depth of emotion and thought that create statements of purpose as artists and as human beings. Statements that can resonate with others and have a massive positive impact on their life. The problem is that the genre and the community surrounding it haven't yet figured out how to allow metal to reach that potential. And that's a result of a sort of subconscious norm of metal that encourages homogenization and does a lot to obstruct different approaches to metal as a form of artistic expression. In my opinion, and as I'll explain throughout the rest of this video, I think that the norms of metal are a reflection of gender norms, and I feel that if these things can be pointed out and discussed, then we can hopefully make it easier for alternatives to find a comfortable place within the community. So let's begin. Metal has always envisioned itself as positioned somewhere outside of the mainstream, and this is at least partially accurate. Metal isn't a very commercially viable genre. It's a subculture and a counterculture. Necessarily, that positions it as somewhere outside of mainstream culture, though it makes more sense to say underneath mainstream culture than outside necessarily. A counterculture is different from a subculture in that a subculture isn't specifically trying to subvert mainstream sensibilities, whereas a counterculture is a deliberate response to mainstream sensibilities. A counterculture, of course, is a form of subculture, but it's a more conscious effort of refusing to reproduce the mainstream culture's norms and expectations. Metal has taken pride in doing so, with many metal fans arguing that one of metal's core values is going places both musically and thematically that other genres and mainstream society at large refuse to go to. The best example of this in the metal community is Satanism. Satanic imagery and lyrics weren't necessarily meant, at least by everyone in the scene, as being an indication of the genre's actual religious affiliations. Satanic imagery and lyrics were more of a response to the mainstream's emphasis on Christianity, especially in America. It was more of an anti-Christian protest than anything. Similarly, metal bands would go against the norms of society by being more overtly sexual, especially talking about things like BDSM, which in the 80s was still a taboo thing to talk about. They would also write politically driven songs about war and about politicians and so on, as a deliberate response to the corruption that they saw from things such as the Cold War. All of this is to say that metal was, indeed, somewhat of a counterculture. It challenged norms that society tried to instill in everyone, and tried to provoke an extreme response to its flagrant refusal to live life the way that the mainstream expected. It only challenged some norms, though, and this is important to discuss because challenging norms is less simple than metal fans might believe. The reality is, we live in a social system, and that's something that's self-evident. We have laws and we have cultural norms that restrict what we can do and what we should do, and it's actually very difficult to challenge these established societal expectations when living within them. By that, I mean, it's much more difficult to write a critique of Christianity when you're a Christian, and much easier when you're an atheist. That doesn't mean that making satanic music and imagery in the 1980s was necessarily easy or without risk, but that it was much easier for atheists in the 1980s to understand the flaws of Christianity because they were already placed outside of it. I'm just gonna say it. Metal is mostly composed of straight men. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Metal may just naturally attract straight men more than any other group, though I'll actually contest this idea later on. What it means, though, is that metal has a much more difficult task of questioning mainstream gender norms than it ever had with questioning something like Christianity because, simply put, straight men are the group that are most often the beneficiaries of gender norms. To be clear, gender is a pervasive part of our world, and it's not something exclusive to women's studies and the like. It actually impacts all of our lives in both positive and negative ways. This is true for straight men as well. However, these issues go often invisible because being a straight man is, in essence, the mainstream norm of gender, inhabiting a gender identity that makes it harder to spot the issues from the inside, and thus harder to critique. By contrast, women, gay men, and trans people have always been positioned somewhat outside of the benefits of hegemony, and thus within mainstream society, these groups are respected less and their gender is called attention to more, which makes it easier to identify the impact that gender issues have on these people. Whereas it's much harder for straight men to identify issues of masculinity within straight men, because for a lot of people that bubble just never gets popped. They never have to think about it. We can all still choose to acknowledge and understand and learn from gender issues, but that requires a conscious effort, which I hope to encourage with this video. What has happened with metal in particular is that the metal subculture has, unknowingly, reproduced the mainstream's conceptions of gender. Straight men are the dominant group, and rightfully so, and any other group is either invisible or subjected to judgment and approval or disapproval from the dominant group. This is why there are so few gay men in metal, and why people like the singer and drummer of Cynic had even said that they were scared to come out because of how the metal community would treat them. And they even admitted how the metal community had already treated them. The reality is that metal has some huge issues with gender that aren't being addressed from people within the community. This is unfortunate because what happens is that this only leaves the discussion to people from outside the community who don't actually know what they're talking about. This is how the metal community gets labeled things like misogynistic. I'm sure metal fans hate hearing that stuff, and I'm sick of hearing it too, but that's mostly because I'm not interested in character judgments, but rather an analysis of what's actually happening. The image that metal broadcasts with women can often appear misogynistic on the surface. Cannibal Corpse, for example, sings explicitly about ultra-gory sexual violence against women. The thing is, these sorts of images are extremely niche within the community and are just the most extreme examples that are used from outsiders to dismiss the entire genre. I don't think looking at bands like Cannibal Corpse gives us a complete picture of what metal actually is or what metal actually values. However, there's a reason why it's bands like Cannibal Corpse that come to represent the genre as a whole for outsiders. And it's not because mainstream media calls extra attention to bands like Cannibal Corpse, or because their extreme imagery and lyrics draw the most negative attention. It's because Cannibal Corpse represents a bigger, implicitly gendered issue in metal culture that is rarely counterindicated by other bands. I'll explain what I mean by that later, though. Okay, so let's get into detail on the way that gender actually operates in art, because I think this is important in uncovering the wider gender issues in metal that I'd like to talk about. In fact, it's not exclusive to art. The way gender operates within art is really just how gender operates within life. Okay, so there are only two genders and two gender expressions recognized by mainstream society in the West: man and woman, masculine and feminine. We could go into the sociological and historical complications of this dichotomy, but we don't have time, so I'll just say that this understanding of gender is technically wrong, but it's still the pervasive norm of the social construction of gender in Western countries. And as such, we'll have to discuss gender on these binary terms for this video. So there are essentially four voices within music and art in general. There's explicitly male, explicitly female, implicitly masculine, and implicitly feminine. What this means is that when writing lyrics from any perspective, the language as well as who is singing or writing lyrics will dictate the gendered voice of the song. An explicitly male voice will be a man who is singing about being a man or some aspect of masculinity directly. By contrast, an implicitly masculine voice will be someone who is singing in such a way that evokes masculine gender norms, but isn't necessarily explicitly about being a man or being masculine. The implicit gendered voices of masculinity and femininity also are not exclusive to the gender that they stem from. A man can sing an implicitly feminine song, and a woman can sing an implicitly masculine song. But as far as I can tell, a man can't sing an explicitly female song, or at the very least, that almost never happens. And same goes for a woman singing an explicitly male song. A great example of explicit male and female voices is actually found in pop with the song Somebody That I Used to Know by Gautier, featuring Kimbra. This one is good because it's explicitly about a man and a woman who break up, and it presents both perspectives within the same song. And so the first verse has an explicitly male voice because it's a man singing from the perspective of being a man, and the second verse has an explicitly female voice because it's a woman singing from the perspective of being a woman. Within metal, most explicit gendered voices in the genre are male. This isn't even a bad thing, and I'll pull some positive examples of explicitly male songs right now. Disposable Heroes by Metallica is a man singing about what it means to be a man in the military. It touches on a very real issue that is explicitly gendered, or at least was at the time. This is a very positive example of how a metal song can have relationship to masculinity that allows for depth and meaningful commentary. My favorite example, which I won't cover in detail because I want to actually do a full analysis of this album someday, is Every Time I Die's album Low Teens. That album is explicitly about the singer's role as a husband and a newly made father, and as a growing man. The album repeatedly touches on themes of gender both explicitly and implicitly, but the album is a very specific contemplation of the singer's masculinity through his examination of his wife and newborn daughter, and how his role as husband and father has impacted their lives. I won't explain what the album is about in full because it's actually much, much deeper than that, but the bottom line is that Low Teens is an example of a whole album that is explicitly about being a man, and so the explicit voice of the album is male. Okay, so here's where we can get somewhere interesting. What exactly is an implicitly gendered voice? Well, let me explain. An explicitly gendered voice is one where the gender expression is self-evident. A man singing about being a man, a woman singing about being a woman. But, stripping away the actual voice of the singer and focusing solely on the lyrics, not aware of the singer's gender, you can still find gender within the voice of the lyrics, even when the songs make no explicit reference to the singer's gender. We can do this because of gender norms. Very quickly, gender norms are commonly understood subconsciously, but rarely talked about in the open outside of social science and psychology. Gender norms are also different for men and women. Essentially, they're expectations of how to perform masculinity and femininity. Men are expected by society to be masculine, and masculine is defined by being strong, powerful, dominant over others, aggressive, sexually forward, and emotionally locked up. Women are expected to be just about the opposite: weak, powerless, submissive, docile, emotionally open, sexually reserved, and so on. These things are not true of all men and women, but the gender norms put pressure on men and women to conform to these ideals and often lead to gender policing for those who don't fit these ideals, which I will discuss later. Emotionally locked up is one I'd love to elaborate on. The whole goal of masculinity is to be powerful. Men are supposedly meant to be leaders and protectors, which is in part where these gender expectations come from. The whole idea of being emotionally locked up is that men are expected to have power over their emotions. Being able to know exactly how you feel about something and exactly what you're supposed to do is a powerful tool for a leader to have. Being emotionally weak, by contrast, won't fare well when your role is to protect and lead others to victory. As such, men are expected not to have emotions, but this manifests itself not in men lacking emotions at all, but in refusing to show emotions that lead to signs of vulnerability. I'll get to this in much more detail later, but I think it's important to establish that this norm is a very essential component of masculinity that relates to what I'm going to talk about. So then what do implicitly masculine and feminine voices and lyrics sound like? Well, they sound like those gender roles. Being emotionally vulnerable, for example, is an implicitly feminine voice, whereas being emotionally strong is implicitly masculine. Lyrics that evoke images of submissiveness are likely going to be understood as feminine, and vice versa. Rinse and repeat over and over again. This is important because across all genres, you can see this cross gender boundaries. You can see women singing masculine lyrics and men singing feminine lyrics. You can see men show vulnerability and women show strength. However, the norms persist that these implicit voices of masculinity and femininity mostly present themselves in the expected culprits. Women being feminine, men being masculine. And again, that's fine. That's expected. And that's what a norm is, something we expect to see. But it's important to understand that the way things are gendered is not always based on the gender of the singer, because that will be very, very important later on when I talk about gender policing. There's another important aspect of implicit gender voices in lyrics, which is how it's directed. Directing things outward is a more masculine trait, and directing things inward is more feminine, because being introspective and mindful is associated with emotional vulnerability, which is associated with women. And being outwardly angry or spiteful or bitter is associated with aggressiveness and dominance over others, which is associated with men. This means that when bands sing about how others have wronged them, if they remove any aspects of introspection from the topic, then the lyrics will be seen as more masculine, even if a woman is singing them, because a woman will be showing emotional strength rather than weakness. And the same is true in reverse. If a man sings about internal struggle and his effect on others, this will risk having him stereotyped as effeminate, because those things are associated with emotional vulnerability, which is associated with being a woman. Okay, here's where things get really interesting. So you know that whole emotional vulnerability thing that I was talking about? How men are expected to be emotionally locked up and in tune with oneself so much that men aren't susceptible to being emotionally harmed? This is an extremely problematic and pervasive aspect of our culture that has been harming men for a very long time now. The reason why it's problematic is because that expectation of men to be emotionally impenetrable is reinforced in such a way as to essentially deny men the right to even have emotions that aren't pre-approved. This is why men are often not allowed to cry, or are made fun of, mocked, insulted, or even punished for showing vulnerability. This is also why male rape victims are rarely taken seriously. It's a very big issue. And the reason why it's a big issue is because, as noble a goal as it may seem to be so in tune with oneself that your emotions can never get the best of you, that's simply not realistic. Nobody is that way. Everyone is capable of vulnerability, and growing as a person oftentimes requires vulnerability. It's a natural part of growing emotionally stronger. The problem is, society tries to weed that out of men through cultural pressure, which means that all nuance is stripped out of the way in which men present themselves, and men are forced to simply pretend to be emotionally perfect, even though men never are because nobody ever is. A good analogy would be like weightlifting. If you've never lifted a weight before in your life, and I told you suddenly that you had to bench press 200 pounds every hour for 5 days straight without ever feeling sore, that would be absurd and impossible. That's the kind of pressure put on men to conform to emotional standards of being strong through hiding any signs of vulnerability. It's just not real, and it's just not possible to be that way. And so pretending to be that way is the only thing people can do. For the sake of this video, I'm going to refer to this kind of expectation of men as hypermasculinity, because it's not just being a man, but it's being such a perfect specimen of a man that it's devoid of any realism. No man is actually emotionally impenetrable to 100% degree. Hypermasculinity only exists in concept. People aren't actually that way. That said, people are often expected to be that way, and this is reinforced through the way that men treat each other, and sometimes even the ways in which women treat men. Instead of being hypermasculine, many men choose to just appear hypermasculine by intentionally removing the nuance from their personalities. They are no longer a normal man, they are now an ideal man, or at least that's how they want to project themselves. This is a fantasy that some men strive for, but it's not possible, and so most men who strive for this create the illusion that it's possible by pretending as though they've already achieved it, whether that be through the way they portray themselves in life, or through the way they portray themselves artistically. Before I tie all of this into heavy metal, I want to talk just a bit about the concept of a power fantasy. Superman is the best example, and here's a very quick clip that I think does a really good job of explaining the concept.
Superman, the concept is basically it's what they call a power fantasy. It means you can't make me go to bed. I'm Superman. I mean, they're projecting themselves in that.
Little kids want to be Superman, yeah.
It's geared for little kids.
So in other words, a power fantasy is an unrealistic version of what people wish they could be. So that way they can project themselves onto that unrealistic version and feel a sense of catharsis as a result. It's fun and it's nice to pretend to be a superhero, but that's specifically because a superhero is more than just a man. The thing is, Superman is the best example because as much as he works as a power fantasy, I'm pretty sure most people would agree he's not an especially compelling character. Flaws make us human, and Superman is not human both literally and symbolically. He has no flaws. That's dull, because it doesn't help build a connection to a character who isn't like us. His character only works as a vessel for people who want to strive to be, well, super. What happens with masculine expectations is that it pressures men to remove the internal conflicts that make them human, and to project themselves as lacking any flaws, essentially, or at the very least, lacking any vulnerability. What this means is that hypermasculinity isn't about being a man, but about being a superman. It's not much more than a power fantasy. The reason why this is relevant is because heavy metal's implicit gendered voice is a hypermasculine power fantasy. What that means is that many singers in metal sing about masculine concepts that are portrayed unrealistically macho compared to ordinary men, and the catharsis of listening to this style of metal is basically the same as a power fantasy, aspiring to be as unrealistically macho as metal bands often portray themselves. And like Superman and other power fantasies, this robs a lot of metal of any nuance and creates a pervasive voice of hypermasculine expectations, exactly like what we see in the typical gender norms of mainstream society. When I say hypermasculine, I don't mean it to be something extreme like the Incredible Hulk. I mean, much more simply, the expectation of men to not show weakness, vulnerability, or submissiveness on physical, psychological, or emotional levels. Or to be as clear as possible, when I say hypermasculine, I mean showing emotional impenetrability and outward aggressiveness. This is so common in metal songs that it's depressing. The best example of hypermasculinity in metal is Pantera's Walk. That song is quite literally a power fantasy. It's a chance for listeners to feel strong and masculine by projecting themselves onto Phil's lyrics. For the record, I like the song Walk. I've always liked it. But I think it's one song that really started pushing metal towards this trend. Other examples of hypermasculinity include, at worst, bands like Five Finger Death Punch, and at best, bands like Tool. Those are two examples. I could name endless others. I've seen hypermasculine lyrics and performance from bands like the Dillinger Escape Plan, Slipknot, Cattle Decapitation, Strapping and Lad, Exodus, Exhorter, Merciful Fate, and plenty more. Of course, I've also seen exceptions, such as Between the Bear to Me and Every Time I Die, and even some of those bands I named have exceptions, such as a lot of stuff on Tool's Lateralis album and some of Dillinger Escape Plan's songs. The problem is not with any individual band or song. There's plenty of power fantasy macho songs that I really like, and I like most of the bands I've mentioned so far. But I also recognize that they're unrealistic and nothing more than power fantasies. The problem is when this unrealistic power fantasy becomes an expectation, a norm within the subculture. And it's definitely a norm now, if it wasn't already one in the 70s and 80s. Certainly, metal has always been a masculine genre for most of its fans, but the issue is that a normalized hypermasculinity within the presentation of metal discourages nuance and exception, and leads to the homogenization of the genre, meaning that metal becomes associated with nothing more than hypermasculinity. This is why Cannibal Corpse is always pointed to by outsiders as what the genre is on the whole. Because even though the genre is less abrasive than that, a major trend within the genre is one that glorifies hypermasculinity in different ways. It doesn't have to be extreme gore imagery and lyrics in order to be hypermasculine and to create that same perception. In the 80s, Merciful Fate sang about raping nuns. In the 90s, Pantera sang about fucking your girlfriend, while Tool told the fan to point your fucking finger up your ass. Even Cattle Decapitation's approach to critiquing anti-LGBT bigotry was extreme, with a gory music video about genital mutilation to make a point about how it's not okay to hate LGBT people for being different. Even discussing a topic that subverts gender norms was discussed in a way that still established a norm of an extreme, hypermasculine approach to the topic. And to be fair, extreme lyrics are not a problem for me at all, and that's not really the problem in general. I'll use a great example of an exception that is simultaneously extreme and nuanced. The song is The Great Secret by Every Time I Die. The first lyric is, this song has an extreme image, but it's not hypermasculine because the implicit voice of the song is actually not rooted in that same sense of being emotionally impenetrable and outwardly aggressive. In fact, you could argue that The Great Secret is sort of a critique of hypermasculinity. Keith Buckley himself has said the following about the song. I learned pretty late in life that my own brain was my worst enemy. My inner monologue had done some terrible things to sabotage my own life. This song is about ignoring what you think and going by how you feel. What the song seems to be about, from listening to it, is Keith's internal anxiety about becoming an adult, in particular becoming a husband. The idea of settling down for a rock star is kind of scary, and this same theme is sort of the basis for Strapping and Lad's Alien album. As such, this song seems to be about Keith's fear of settling down and being a normal adult. You could see the lyrics of the song as sort of being a hypermasculine voice inside of Keith's head, telling him not to conform, or to grow and settle down and be a normal man just like everyone else, that it'd be better to be dead than to be normal. In this sense, it demonstrates how hypermasculinity can come into conflict with real men. What I'm trying to say is that metal is a genre of extremes, but more precisely, it's a genre of one specific extreme. This extreme is not just represented by the overt Satanism and gore that we saw with bands in death metal and black metal, but it's also represented by the general tone of metal bands who express anger and criticism, because these things often lack any subtlety or self-awareness. Metal is an angry genre, but it's an angry genre that is angry in a not particularly interesting way. It's the kind of anger that men are expected to express, and there's nothing countercultural about that. It's dull, it's predictable, and it's normal. Okay, so now that that's all been covered, it's time to go into the implications of what these trends in metal mean for the community and the genre itself. First, I want to talk about the community. Finally, it's time to get into gender policing. What happens when bands portray themselves in this outwardly aggressive, emotionally impenetrable way is that it attracts people who aspire to these things, or at the very least, find catharsis in fantasizing about it. This has clear limitations. Nobody is going to go around killing people because they heard Cannibal Corpse. But when listening to a genre of predominantly straight men talking about how manly and strong they are, and how much the people they don't like are terrible and worthless, this leads to the norm of hypermasculinity within the genre being the barometer for how a lot of fans perceive the genre's rules for what kind of music can be made and who's allowed to make or listen to it. This leads to metal policing, which is where we get to the kinds of elitism within the community that label certain bands or fans posers, and label things true metal or false metal, saying things like, that's not metal. These kinds of fans will often call people they don't like faggots or pussies, and constantly try to dictate what are proper and improper ways of being a part of metal culture. The reality is that, while not everyone in the community does this, a lot of people do, and oftentimes do it unknowingly. And it's because of the norm of hypermasculinity within the genre. It draws a crowd who aspire to be hypermasculine and police things that don't fit those hypermasculine ideals. What most people don't realize is that calling things not metal or metal and calling people posers is actually, on some level at least, a gendered thing. Because a lot of people, both from outside and inside the culture, falsely equate the genre of metal with the hypermasculinity that has become a trend within the genre and community. The term metal, as an abstract concept, becomes synonymous with hypermasculine. And so when something is not true metal, it's often because it doesn't fit the hypermasculine ideal. What this means is that true metal is hypermasculine, and anything that isn't hypermasculine can risk being labeled feminine and thus not metal. This is true of bands, of songs and albums, and of fans. What this does is it prevents men from being able to express sentiments that aren't pre-approved metal sentiments like I hate you, or Hail Satan, or war is bad. It means that a man displaying vulnerability in performance or lyrics isn't metal enough. It also means that gay men such as Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinert of Cynic had to be afraid of coming out after 20 years in the metal scene, not just because they could be harassed, but because they had already been harassed just for not being masculine enough, for not being metal enough. This is honestly shameful. A genre that prides itself on being able to subvert mainstream society and offer a community to others who don't fit well into the mainstream shouldn't turn around and police its own community by making the community hostile to people who are already disproportionately targeted by the mainstream in the first place. So here's where things get a little weird. For the most part, I've been discussing metal's relationship with men, and men within the community's relationship with each other. Men who obsess over metal as a bastion of hypermasculinity treat other men like crap for not being manly enough, and this makes it harder for bands to express ideas that don't fit this mold of aggressiveness and dominance, which makes it harder for the genre to explore new possibilities both thematically and artistically. But what about the genre's relationship with women? And no, I'm not talking about how women are portrayed in the songs. I'm talking about women in the scene and in bands. Keep in mind that this isn't my best area of expertise. Most women singers I listen to are from different genres, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I wanted to go back to this concept of explicit and implicit gender in lyrics. I looked at lyrics from various well-known metal women. Specifically, I looked at Arch Enemy, Abnormality, and Butcher Babies. This isn't based on their quality as bands. I mean, in all fairness, I'm not really a big fan of any of these bands, though I don't think any of them are bad. The thing is, as far as I've been able to discern from the community, Arch Enemy and Abnormality are respected bands with women singers, whereas Butcher Babies and, of course, Baby Metal are considered terrible by a lot of people within the community. This obviously could just be that the style of music that Butcher Babies and Baby Metal play isn't for everyone, but what I find interesting is that Arch Enemy and Abnormality make femininity not a very core part of their style or sound. Oftentimes people react to specifically Abnormality by being shocked to find out that the singer was even a woman at all. The same has been true of Arch Enemy at times. The thing is, Butcher Babies and Baby Metal very much do incorporate femininity as a major part of their sound and style. Butcher Babies' lyrics make explicit reference to feminine topics, and Baby Metal's femininity is self-evident just in their singing voices. Meanwhile, Arch Enemy and Abnormality have lyrics that are very vaguely metal lyrics, and don't call attention to anything specifically feminine, and sometimes even write the same sort of hypermasculine lyrics such as in Arch Enemy's Nemesis, which is itself just a power fantasy about defeating your enemies. By contrast, Butcher Babies has songs like Blonde Girls All Look the Same that very explicitly draw on feminine concepts and present a feminine perspective. I'm not saying that this alone is the reason why the metal community in large accepts Arch Enemy and dislikes Butcher Babies, but what I'm saying is that it's interesting that metal women who end up getting respect tend to present a more implicitly masculine perspective in their singing and lyrics, and I wonder if there might be a correlation there. I guess you could call that homework for anyone who's actually interested in that topic. Of course, there is also the sort of misogyny surrounding the topic. Looking at the comments of an article about Arch Enemy versus the comments of an article about Butcher Babies, I saw a stark contrast. The Arch Enemy article had comments saying that metal isn't about gender and that as long as it's good music, it shouldn't matter what your gender is. The Butcher Babies article had people saying that the band probably slept their way to success. While these won't necessarily be the same people saying the same things, I think it does demonstrate a sort of series of mixed messages about how metal culture values femininity in women. I guess you could call it a gut feeling, but it definitely feels to me as though metal tends to value women when they act more masculine and blend into the hypermasculine norm that metal seems to expect people to adopt. And for the record, this idea that women get more respect in male-dominated spaces, but only if they act like men, and abandon any affinity with femininity, is actually a well-documented phenomenon. One that has affected how women are treated in various career paths, and girls showing gender non-conformity even at a young age. By contrast, it's also been well documented that men and boys acting more feminine is met with extra hostility. And this is where the topic of gender policing is so relevant, is because while these trends aren't exactly being documented within the metal community, I've personally seen these more mainstream trends present themselves in the subculture and its rhetoric. And I think actual meaningful studies into the topic would lead to a lot of valuable info on the culture. So to summarize all of that, there are hints within the community that women are only valued based on how well they can compare to men, and men are stripped of their value if they don't keep up the illusion of a hypermasculine persona in their music and stage performance, and so on. The end result of creating a norm of hypermasculine expression is that it encourages hostility towards anything else. That's what hypermasculinity is. It's hostile by definition, because it values outward aggression, domination, and a lack of self-reflection. And so it attracts those kinds of people. And those kinds of people oftentimes can be, to put it realistically, bigots. I've seen a lot of misogyny, a lot of casual sexism, a lot of homophobia, some anti-Semitism and racism, and a hell of a lot of transphobia within smaller circles in the metal community. This is a major problem, and it's the inevitable result of the homogenization of metal culture as valuing hypermasculinity above any and all else. I want to single out specifically the transphobia within the community for a few reasons. The first is that transphobia is one of the issues most directly tied to gender issues. The second is that transphobia affects a very small portion of the population, and is also very newly being addressed with a push towards trans rights and acceptance. What this means is that, because it's so new and affects such a small group, within the public eye at large, transphobia is kind of given this sort of matter-of-fact assumed credibility. Being transphobic is okay because it's picking on a group that is so small and has such a tiny voice within any community that anyone can get away with doing so. As a result, it's one of the forefront issues of gender in the metal community because nobody in the community is going to hold anyone accountable for being transphobic, unlike other issues. For the record, the issues of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and various other issues are all very important issues within any community, including the metal community. However, there has been progress made on these issues, such as with Rob Halford and Roddy Bottum both coming out as gay in the 90s. Since transphobia is such a newly discussed issue in the mainstream, the subculture hasn't really had any time to even begin a conversation on the place of trans people in the community. There are no major trans musicians in metal that have allowed trans people to inhabit any position of respect in the community, and the same is true in the mainstream at large. Very few trans voices are heard in general, and this is where the most disgusting and vile rhetoric from members of the community come out, because this is where they can get away with saying the worst things. This video isn't going to devolve into debunking transphobia, because that would be counterproductive. The reality is that transphobia is a conspiracy theory. Biologists, sociologists, and psychologists are rapidly updating their understandings of sex and gender as scientific and social concepts, and anyone who is denying that trans people are valid have to go up against the conclusion that experts have been unanimously coming to for quite a while. To deny the conclusions that experts have reached requires believing in a conspiracy, and so quite literally, transphobia is a conspiracy theory, much like climate change denial. However, this sort of rhetoric flies free within the metal community. This is a real issue because it means that a portion of metal fans are made to be unsafe and unwelcome because of a general hostility from some men in the community. It also means that trans voices are stifled altogether and the predominant voice of metal remains one that's hypermasculine and hateful of anything outside of that. It also means that metal has the potential to render itself irrelevant by a refusal to make any changes or evolve or even reflect on itself. It means that metal is content with moving backwards. It means that this idea that gender doesn't matter doesn't ring true within the culture. And it means that the culture again reinforces the mainstream by labeling people that aren't like them as unworthy of respect or support. It also means that we've established a norm within the subculture that creates barriers to who is allowed to participate based on nothing more than what pronouns they use and what clothes they wear. And that just has no value to any culture or any genre. And when we don't call out the kind of hypermasculine flexing that metal fans use to police the way that people are allowed to look, speak, think, and sound within the community, we allow that to remain the norm, which further pushes the genre into bigotry and ignorance. But even beyond that, it pushes the genre into mediocrity and monotony. It doesn't just make metal hostile, it makes metal boring. All of these issues stem from two things. First is the tendency for subcultures to reinforce the dominant culture through the inability to reflect on what the dominant culture is doing wrong. Essentially, metal prides itself on rebellion, but doesn't actually know what it's rebelling against, and so it ends up reproducing the same issues that the dominant culture perpetuates, while metal assumes itself to be somehow countercultural, which I'd argue it only is on the surface. The second is the false equivalency of metal's sound and ideology with hypermasculinity. You see, a lot of people might argue that metal only attracts so many hypermasculine straight guys because that's what metal sounds like, and hypermasculine straight guys are naturally drawn to that sound, while other groups aren't, and that other groups don't belong simply because the genre isn't for them. This is utter nonsense. The reality is that at some point, certain aesthetic features of metal and rock became associated with masculinity because they became associated with aggression and with the men who often were in the bands themselves. This is very important because the reality is that metal is not about hypermasculinity. In fact, it's not necessarily about masculinity or even aggression. Metal is a loud and fast genre. The same is also true of punk, some industrial, and various forms of experimental music. Extreme music on the whole has a large influence of loudness and fastness. These things come to be associated with aggression, but that doesn't mean they inherently are. Use dictates meaning. By that, I'm saying that how you use fast and loud music and how you contextualize it thematically determines the implications of emotion and even gender within the music. Let's just stick with one emotion for now: anger. Anger is associated with aggression, which is associated with masculinity, which means that anger is often seen as a man's emotion. By hearing angry music, like certain metal bands, people will think of it as masculine. This is why people will say that metal is too angry or too violent, because they associate the sound with the gendered assumptions of anger. But to assume that anger is explicitly a man's emotion is absurd. Women get angry too. However, the context of women's anger is often different from men's anger, and that's why women don't end up gravitating towards angry music from men. It's because men's anger is often lacking in self-awareness and is outwardly aggressive, blaming others, attacking others, etc., while women's anger is usually directed internally towards themselves, with something that isn't as common of a sentiment to express in metal. The thing is, the sound doesn't even have to be associated with anger in the first place. Loud and fast will inevitably evoke some emotion that remind audiences of loudness and fastness, but anger is not the only one. There's also anxiety, frustration, tension, fear, self-loathing, determination, self-empowerment, compassion. These things can all be experienced and expressed in loud and strong ways. These things are not always aggressive, but then again, loud and fast sounds are not inherently aggressive. The problem is that, because the dominant subject of metal is often hypermasculinity, it creates the false equivalency between abrasive music and hypermasculine traits, which alienates and pushes out people who don't have any interest in those ideals. I'll speak from personal experience. I am in no way one of those people. Hypermasculinity bores me for the most part, and my favorite lyricists are always people who can reflect on their life and show vulnerability. That's more meaningful, it's more interesting, it's more compelling, and it's actually more intimidating and scary because at the end of the day, it's more real. I'll point to some examples of singers showing emotions other than outward aggression, anger and hate, and how alternative emotions can often add more power to the message of songs. First up, and I know I reference this band a lot, but Every Time I Die's song Underwater Bimbos from Outer Space is probably one of the heaviest songs ever written. What's interesting about it is that the song isn't really about anger, it's more about grief than anything. Specifically, it seems to be about a contemplation on musicians that the singer knew from the same scene who had passed away, and how he feels uncomfortable with having outlived them. The opening line of the song is one of the best lyrics I've ever heard.
I want to be dead with my friends. I want to be dead with my friends. Why I'm really dying in the rest. I want to be dead with my friends. I want to be dead with my friends.
Following that, Converge has two songs about grief, one called Dark Horse and one called All We Love We Leave Behind, which cover the topic from different angles. Both are fantastic, but I'm going to talk about Dark Horse specifically. Dark Horse is sort of a send-off song of pride towards, I believe, a specific friend of the singer who had passed away, a tribute towards him and a reflection on life. There's one very beautiful passage. Here it sounds like he's basically saying that his friends who he's lost have paved the way for him to become a stronger and better person, and he's thankful for their sacrifices. And that's something interesting that isn't just outward anger, and can be expressed in a loud and fast way, because the loudness and fastness of the song sort of represents triumph. White Walls by Between the Buried and Me is one of my favorite examples, because the main emotions expressed throughout the song are exhaustion and uncertainty. The song is about the band themselves having performed at Ozfest, and feeling as though the industry wanted them to be rock gods, to be larger than life and inhumanly amazing, and they felt like they were losing touch with what they wanted to be as a band. And so White Walls is a deliberate response to that, where they were trying to make sense of who they were within the metal scene. They eventually decided they needed to start from scratch and try to make music for themselves, and not fixate so much on what the industry was pressuring from them. The explanation of why eventually gets revealed in the lyrics.
This is all we have. When we die, with what's left of us. When we die.
These are only a few examples of many different ways in which metal can take the fast and loud approach of music and create interesting, humanizing, relevant expressions and have it work. There's also, of course, Mastodon's Crack the Sky, which is easily one of the greatest albums ever produced, and that's one that isn't really much about masculinity at all. It's a mixture of a concept album and a sort of love letter to the drummer's sister from the drummer. It mixes personal turmoil, regret, depression, hopelessness, and desperation into a really powerful journey of an album that begs the question, how far can we fall into nothingness before it's too late to come back? It's sort of about trying to make your way back to Earth as a metaphor for coping with the loss of a loved one, as well as the feeling of failure and impotence that comes with not being able to save them. Really, I could probably make an analysis of this whole album someday too, and I really recommend it to anyone, even people who don't like metal at all, because it's not hyper-masculine, it's not even really aggressive, but it can still easily be described as metal.
I tried to fall into the ground, breaking all the fingers and the nails from my hand. The eyes of the child see no wrong. Ignorant bliss and bending blows. Bright eyes fading faster than stars falling. How can I tell you that I
Anyways, the biggest takeaway from this video should be the following. Metal has awkward issues with how it handles masculinity and places gender from within, and these issues restrict the artistry of musicians, including men, but especially women and LGBT people who may have alternative perspectives on how to approach the music. Allowing this to be the norm causes stagnation in the sound and themes of metal, which reduces the genre's longevity. And in order to deal with this issue, the community needs to get itself in check by addressing these issues as implicitly gendered issues, and working towards disrupting this norm by making sure that bigotry doesn't have a seat at the table of discussion, and by welcoming artists and voices in the community that present perspectives that aren't necessarily in line with hypermasculine expectations. If we can disrupt this norm, then we can hypothetically allow the sort of power fantasies that people enjoy to coexist with stranger and more introspective acts without any need for hostility. The elitism of metal is more than just a small group of people being assholes in the scene for no reason other than that they can. It's a bigger problem of the way metal relates to itself and the way men relate to it. Undoing the elitism requires understanding it, and the reality is that the elitism is an inevitable result of undervaluing any type of artistry within the scene that isn't hypermasculine. If you're interested in seeing metal drop some of its hostility and learn to be a bit more level-headed, this is where we start. Thanks for watching.